This whole thing could be over in a couple of days if we were the type of nation that chose to unleash all of our power without regard to the innocent civilians that would be killed.
We will launch it violently. We will launch it in a way that will make it decisive so that we can get it over as quickly as possible, and there's no question who won when it's over.
Iraq's president promised the mother of all battles. For Iraq, it was. Its enemies employed the latest, fearsome military technology, first in 38 days of aerial bombardment.
There he goes.
Iraq was pounded by precision bombing intended to cripple its fighting capacity without inflicting severe losses on civilians. Chemical warfare was feared and prepared for. That and a full-scale naval conflict were two of the horrors the international Allied forces were to be spared. Speed and deception were used to fulfill the United Nations resolutions that Kuwait be recovered. The initial air offensive was designed to flatten everything that enabled Iraq to fight. Then came a rapid land offensive which lasted just 100 hours. The most modern artillery systems ever put on a battlefield blasted Iraq's army to pieces. During the land campaign, nearly 200,000 Iraqi troops gave themselves up. It was humiliation on the grandest scale imaginable.
No.
Kuwait suffered grievously. The Iraqis blew up many of its major buildings as they faced defeat. In the cells of their city, many Kuwaitis were tortured by Iraq's ruthless agents.
They put their feet up and they roll it.
When the Iraqis departed, Kuwaitis gratefully destroyed the emblems of a hated regime. Arabs welcomed Arab liberators. The Allied High Command deliberately let partners from the Gulf itself retake Kuwait City. Iraq's military might lay in ruins. Perhaps 100,000 of its troops were killed or wounded against 150 Allied troops dead in the mounting of Operation Desert Storm. Saddam Hussein, the man whose ambitions caused the war in the Gulf. A dictator ruling by fear, yet one who had been capable of generating reverence from many of his countrymen who believed his delusion that he could unite the entire Arab world in a single state. A leader who portrayed himself as the reincarnation of King Nebuchadnezzar, who ruled from Babylon in biblical times. As in so many totalitarian states, the leader's presence was felt and celebrated everywhere. His full name, Saddam Hussein al-Takriti, after his small hometown of Takrit, north of Baghdad. That's where he first joined the Ba'athist Party, before literally fighting his way to prominence, personally murdering rivals on his way to ultimate control of the party and the country. A long motorcade winds north into the foothills around the Iraqi town of Mosul. Among the cars, Saddam's own white Mercedes is heavily armoured, a legacy of an assassination attempt during Iraq's previous, much longer war against Iran. This is Saddam's home country, the area where he was born and the area where he set up the infrastructure to develop much of his chemical and nuclear capability. Local people were encouraged to meet their leader. Saddam's more usually seen surrounded by his military, well guarded against possible troublemakers. There is potential for trouble here, though. The Kurdish population have agitated for self-rule, agitation which has produced civil war in the past, perhaps explaining to some extent Saddam's persecution complex, his readiness to use brutal methods of suppression. This official Iraqi film reconstructs one major step on young Saddam Hussein's violent road to the top. It portrays Saddam apparently killing the then president in 1959. In fact, only one person was wounded, Saddam himself, and by one of his own side. In the 60s, Iraq suffered a series of coups as the ruling military engaged in a power struggle with the emerging Baathists, a nationalist socialist party in which Saddam was playing an increasingly important role. This finally seized power in 1968 in the person of Colonel Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr. He fostered the career of his cousin, Saddam Hussein, and worked hard to forge deals with France and Russia, the countries whose armaments would help to build modern Iraqi power. President Barker courted the Soviets in particular, negotiating a $300 million loan to exploit a new oil field. He also concluded with them a treaty of friendship that ensured his country would be well armed by the Soviet Union. Saddam finally became known to the world at large when he became Iraq's vice president. For a street fighter, it was quite a change. He took charge of improving his country's relations with a range of non-aligned powers. Saddam became president in 1979 and within a year launched a huge offensive against Iraq's ancient enemy in the east, Iran. His strategy was a blitzkrieg intended to demoralize and scatter the Iranian forces, expected to be weak after the internal upheavals Iran had been through after the overthrow of the Shah. But it was a war started, like that with the Allies, with little apparent idea of how to end it. Just as he'd failed in his assassination attempt 20 years earlier, Saddam Hussein's war against Iran would prove to be another enterprise that failed for lack of planning. But it only failed after Saddam used chemical weapons, first in the Iran war, then against his own Kurdish population. In the village of Halabja, 5,000 people died. Professed horror at this genocide. Further attacks killed at least 5,000 more Kurdish civilians. Other civilians were casualties as each side in the war used long-range rockets against population centers. It was reminiscent of the Blitz, except that modern rockets caused much wider damage during the War of the Cities. It's thought as many as 1 million people may have died between 1980 and the ceasefire reluctantly agreed to by Iran in 1988. Saddam saw it all as worthwhile in pursuit of wider regional objectives, the dreams of Iraq at the pinnacle of Arab power, enjoying the wealth that oil from surrounding states could provide. Instead, both Iraq and Iran were badly damaged, but Saddam was to prove a man who did not learn from his mistakes. For all his military uniforms and titles, Saddam Hussein never served in Iraq's armed forces and never had military training. But like so many dictators before him, Saddam didn't regard the lack of practical experience as a handicap. He involved himself closely in the running of the campaign against Iran. The war with Iran left him with an army several times larger than when he came to power, an army that as much as his secret police kept him in power. Any officers who stepped out of line were purged, trusted no farther than the political commissars attached to every unit. Eventually, he had 1 million men under arms, but only the elite Republican Guard came anywhere near Western standards of professionalism. Nevertheless, Iraq's army was much the biggest in the Middle East and the 4th biggest in the world. Missiles formed a major part of its weaponry. 70 batteries of anti-aircraft rockets were in place when Allied aircraft came into the attack. When it came to tanks, Iraq had over 4,000, many more than any of its neighbors, most supplied by the Soviet Union, like so much of Iraq's armor. Despite the public display, secrecy was a mania in Saddam's Iraq. Farzad Bazot was an Iranian-born journalist working for The Observer. In Iraq, he investigated a disastrous explosion at a weapons plant. Arrested for allegedly spying on sensitive installations, Iraqi TV showed him supposedly confessing to being an Israeli agent.
I gathered information during my trips to the battlefront from the military officers, Iraqi military officers and Iraqi citizens, which and I took pictures as well, which I handed over to the Israeli intelligence. I wrote reports and I handed over to the Israeli intelligence.
Soon afterwards, Bazov was hanged. The world was appalled, but Saddam ignored all appeals for clemency. The world was to be shocked again when the Iraqis were caught trying to smuggle triggers for nuclear bombs. Saddam tried to ridicule Western fears by showing he already had such equipment, but the difference between them was clear. That scandal was followed by the row over Iraq's apparent attempt to build a supergun. Long pipes, which the Iraqis said were for repairing oil links, were reckoned to be parts for a huge gun. One prototype supergun had a range of 112 miles. Again, Saddam denied everything. Again, he wasn't believed. The much photographed monument in central Baghdad to what was claimed as victory in the Iran-Iraq war epitomized Saddam Hussein's grandiose view of his country's destiny. Once again, though, truth was turned on its head. The accusing fingers on the statues of dead commanders pointing at Iran symbolized eternal hatred of that country, obscuring the fact that Iraq's next move would be in a totally different direction: Kuwait. H. Norman Schwarzkopf, the man brought to the desert by Iraq's new ambitions. A man with no first name because his father, hating the family name Herbert, passed it on only as the initial H. A blunt-talking soldier who came with his own message for Saddam Hussein.
Let's face it, if he dares come across that border and come down here, I'm completely confident that we're going to kick his butt when he gets here. It's going to be because of you folks right here.
It's a good few years since America produced a top military man with quite the swagger, charisma and high public profile of this four-star general. But the public display had a purpose. Schwarzkopf believes good and highly visible public relations help to instill self-confidence in his troops, giving them a vital winning edge in combat, and he exploits his common touch to give them a strong sense of involvement. Schwarzkopf was the man who devised Operation Desert Storm and Operation Desert Shield before it.
My gut told me the same thing ever since I've been here, and that's we've got a big job to do, and every night when I go to bed at night, I think what I'm going to do the next morning when I get up, and every morning when I get up, I think what I'm going to do every hour after that. You know, this is a big enterprise over here and a lot of responsibility, and I take it very, very seriously, and frankly, half the night I think about it too. So that's just the nature of the job.
Schwarzkopf's daily progress around the Saudi capital was reminiscent of a presidential cavalcade, though to his contemporaries, Schwarzkopf is fondly thought of as a dirty boots warrior. To his own men, he's known sometimes as Stormin' Norman, a reference to his occasional bursts of temper, and often as Bear. Like George Washington, Schwarzkopf was trained at West Point, the United States academy that produces the cream of the country's potential military leaders. While there, he made no secret of expecting one day to lead his country in a war vital to its interests. Despite a high IQ of 170, he was only 43rd out of 480 in the class of 56, though the college yearbook described Schwartzy as a connoisseur of life, and an excellent competitor whose spirit would assure him of future success. A veteran of Vietnam and Grenada, campaigns which both embarrassed the United States military, Schwarzkopf was determined that his next war would be different. As long ago as 1983, he predicted that it would be here in the desert, with Iraqi ambitions the most likely trigger. 5 days before the invasion of Kuwait, he was talking his 350 officers through his own plan. An amateur magician, Operation Desert Storm was entirely his scheme for conjuring victory from the desert sands. He left nothing to chance. Its details filled a book the size of the Manhattan telephone directory. The Saudi king Fahd. Schwarzkopf's serious tasks included diplomacy at the highest level. There were, despite the appalling tasks ahead, less serious moments to enjoy.
Holding my stomach. Yeah, I can see that. No, I wasn't either. I was just joking.
However, the grim realities of war which Saddam Hussein had made inevitable would not be long delayed. The first steps to that war came on July the 24th, 1990. Iraq amassed 30,000 troops along its border with Kuwait. At the time, the troop movements were seen simply as Iraqi pressure on Kuwait to join Saddam Hussein's demands for higher oil prices to pay for his war with Iran. A former diplomat in the region, Sir John Moberly.
Well, I don't think that it will come to actual conflict, fighting with troops. I think these are maneuvers intended to reinforce Iraq's diplomatic pressure to make the Kuwaitis do what the Iraqis want in terms of the policies that will keep the oil price up.
Saddam Hussein had, nevertheless, resurrected Iraq's historical claim to Kuwait, the jewel in the crown of the Gulf. On the 2nd of August, his troops ruthlessly translated that claim into military invasion, reaching the capital, Kuwait City, early in the morning. The invasion took civilians by surprise, but Iraq's forces, although clearly outnumbering the Kuwaitis, didn't have it all their own way. From a window overlooking the American embassy, an amateur cameraman filmed a Kuwaiti armored car fighting back. Smoke poured from the barracks of the Kuwait Royal Guard, who formed the core of resistance as they fought to protect the Emir's palace. However bravely the Kuwaitis fought, they were seriously outgunned. The arrival of Iraqi helicopter gunships marked the beginning of the end. Iraqi airborne troops rapidly finished the brief but bloody struggle by Kuwaitis to retain their independence and deny Saddam his dream of domination. At least one Iraqi helicopter was brought down, the fate of its crew uncertain. Casualty figures in the invasion remain unknown, but the price the tiny country of Kuwait paid was undoubtedly high. Hundreds died trying to defy Saddam's military might. The rape of Kuwait had begun. Iraqi soldiers, not without sometimes daring opposition, were systematically to pillage and terrorize the country. Mass graves would be discovered. The Emir of Kuwait fled to Saudi Arabia, the temporary end of 200 years of rule by the Al Sabah royal family. Of the countries now in the Gulf area, Kuwait existed as long ago as 1757. What's now Iraq was then only 3 provinces of the Turkish Ottoman Empire, ruled from Constantinople. Basra, like the 2 other provinces, was rife with Arab opposition to rule from Turkey. It was Lawrence of Arabia who won Arabs to the British side in the First World War against the Turks who fought with the Germans. As a result, Britain promised King Faisal an independent Arab kingdom. Syria had already been promised to the French, so Faisal became ruler of the artificial country of Iraq. Kuwait had a much older independent existence, as this 18th century map shows. Close association with Britain, it had been a protectorate since 1891, didn't end with formal independence in 1961. Only weeks after, Britain was forced to send paratroopers and other units to protect Kuwait against the threat of Iraqi invasion, an eerie forerunner of things to come.
It's an unfinished airport just outside Kuwait, and it's pretty hot. Behind me you can see the 2nd Battalion of paratroopers coming in from Aden and Cyprus. The landing, of course, is unopposed.
Kuwaiti independence was always precarious. On this occasion, the defense of Kuwait was successful. Iraq believed the West protected countries like Kuwait because they were happy to keep oil prices low. 30 years later, Iraq could no longer tolerate low oil prices, which were wrecking its own economy. Another attempt to absorb Kuwait began. Western leaders quickly condemned the invasion. British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher froze Kuwaiti assets in London to keep them out of Iraqi hands. President Bush made his views clear.
We're not ruling any options in, but we're not ruling any options out.
We have already frozen all Kuwaiti assets. Kuwaitis have very considerable assets, and it's important that those do not fall into Iraq hands. Iraq, we believe, has only very, very small assets and rather a lot of debts, so the position is rather different with her.
At the United Nations, a new unity emerged in the face of the Iraqi invasion. The Security Council condemned Iraqi aggression in Kuwait. The old East-West divisions didn't totally disappear, but the Soviet Union did support sanctions against Iraq when the vote came 4 days later. Only 2 members of the Security Council voted against, Yemen and Cuba. President Bush did manage to carry Soviet President Gorbachev with him, at least as far as supporting the sanctions and eventually backing some military action to liberate Kuwait. What's more, Kuwaiti leaders arriving in Cairo for a crisis meeting of the Arab League found much support for their cause among leaders like Hosni Mubarak of Egypt. Even Arab nations traditionally less than friendly to the West, like Syria, were not afraid to condemn Iraq and later on back their condemnation with military muscle. Perhaps the staunchest ally was Saudi Arabia, whose leader King Fahd knew Iraqi ambitions might not stop at the Saudi border. 12 of the 20 Arab nations at the summit agreed to send forces to defend Saudi Arabia and free Kuwait. American Secretary of State James Baker, visiting King Fahd, can scarcely have hoped for a more comprehensive alliance of Arab states against Saddam. He could now be sure that America would not be acting without considerable Arab support. The last hurdle of congressional qualms about sending troops to the Gulf was crossed with unexpected ease. The day after the UN voted for sanctions, the Allied military build-up in the Gulf began in earnest as President Bush dispatched 4,000 troops of the 82nd Airborne Division to Saudi Arabia. America's military machine swung into action. Guns were embarked, ships sailed to reinforce those already in the Gulf. The President insisted the troops were there for defensive purposes.
I want to be clear about what we are doing and why. America does not seek conflict, nor do we seek to chart the destiny of other nations. But America will stand by her friends. The mission of our troops is wholly defensive. Hopefully, they will not be needed long. They will not initiate hostilities, but they will defend themselves, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and other friends in the Persian Gulf.
Mrs. Thatcher expressed her dissatisfaction at the refusal of some European countries to put their full military weight behind the alliance of forces rapidly building up in Saudi Arabia, outside the traditional NATO area of activity.
We all came in very firmly with political support, that some of the military support from some countries was much more hesitant and it was patchy and much later, and that therefore we set out the solution that NATO as such must be more ready to put defensive forces out of area. So I set out the facts in the speech, defined the problem and proposed the solution. It seems to me admirable.
At sea, sanctions began to take effect. Iraq had only one currency-earning export, oil. As Western leaders pointed out, that made it almost uniquely vulnerable to the kind of international action that had failed in other cases.
British warship, what is your cargo, please?
My cargo is crude oil.
Thank you very much. What was your last port in the Gulf, please?
Last port in Gulf is in Fujairah.
Thank you very much. Goodbye. Have a safe trip.
In Iraq itself, there appeared to be no waning of popular support for Saddam. These women working in the fields chanted, "Bush, Bush, hands off Iraq." But gauging public opinion in a dictatorship where individual opinions can be fatal is not easy. Rationing was introduced, but there seemed to be no shortages. The Iraqis did, however, claim that medical supplies were running short, even though UN sanctions expressly excluded them. This child was said to be dying from leukemia because the drugs to treat him were not available. Not for the last time in the conflict, truth and propaganda were difficult to disentangle. In Jordan, the port of Aqaba was in effect blockaded to Iraqi shipping. Jordan's crucial trade with Iraq along the Amman-Baghdad highway was crippled. The trucks were replaced by thousands of refugees, hundreds of thousands of them, fleeing from Kuwait and Iraq into Jordan. Some had to wait days in the scorching heat of the desert to cross the border. Some escaped with nothing but their lives. For King Hussein of Jordan, the conflict was a catastrophe. He walked a tightrope, trying to maintain Jordan's trade and good relations with Iraq, while simultaneously staying friends with his Western allies. His attempts to keep the peace came to nothing. Back in Jordan, he was under severe pressure because of pro-Iraq demonstrations in Amman, as in other Arab capitals, even those in the alliance. On the street, Arab distrust of American motives and intentions continued unabated, even faced with a unique collaboration between the West and Arab states. By September, events in the Gulf had taken an even more sinister turn. On the 4th, 300 women and children arrived in Baghdad, having traveled overland from Kuwait. They were hostages, human shields as Saddam called them, there to deter Allied attacks on the Iraqi capital. Hundreds of Westerners had been rounded up in Kuwait, hundreds more were still in hiding. Others lived a bizarre life, camping out in the grounds of various Western embassies in Baghdad. They managed to maintain a measure of comfort compared with those living in Saddam's hands, even receiving letters from home. The callous inhumanity of Saddam's hostage-taking, one Western leader called it the tactic of the outlaw, reached the height of hypocrisy when Iraqi television started a new slot, Guest News. Viewers around the world saw these Iraqi pictures of hostages. None was more sickening than this scene between Saddam Hussein himself and a 5-year-old British boy, Stuart Lockwood. Through his translator, Saddam inquired after the boy's health and diet.
Are you getting your milk, Stuart? And with cornflakes too? I don't think all Iraqi kids can get cornflakes now.
Saddam Hussein is now trying, in his tactics, to hide behind Western women and children and use them as human shields and use them as part of his negotiations. We do not enter into such negotiations. These people are entitled to certain fundamental human rights which are being totally flouted to the repugnance of the whole of the civilized world.
But for some politicians, like ex-Prime Minister Edward Heath, it was still possible to talk to Saddam. Mr. Heath travelled to Baghdad in October to plead for the freedom of old and sick hostages. And he met with some success. Saddam released 33 British hostages. Their feelings were mixed.
Tinged with sadness because we've left our son in Kuwait. It's him and all those like him that we must keep on at the government to get them home peacefully.
The former German Chancellor Willy Brandt followed in Mr. Heath's footsteps on a mercy mission to Baghdad, as did Kurt Waldheim, the ex-Secretary General of the United Nations, and the Japanese Premier Mr. Nakasone. Perhaps the most controversial of these mercy missions was that mounted by American politician Jesse Jackson. He carried Stuart Lockwood, the boy who appeared with Saddam, down the steps of the plane at Heathrow Airport. With him were 200 other released hostages. But leaders of the alliance against Saddam strongly criticized these missions.
That I find it grisly and repulsive that the Iraqis should set about deciding who is so sick, who is so old, that they should be released from a position in which no human being should ever be placed.
The final release of all captives did not come until December, after the United Nations had passed a resolution sanctioning the use of force against Iraq. News of the release came as a surprise.
Saddam Hussein is going to release everybody that's put in a statement asking the government to release everybody. Can we just have your opinion?
I like that. It's great. No, I'm very, very happy. It's overwhelming.
By now, Saddam and his Revolutionary Council of Iraq realized the Western and Arab nations were assembling a vast armed force against them. The grim prospect of a looming war did not deter them, though. Among the units landing in Saudi Arabia were the famous British desert rats. They'd earned their proud nickname fighting Rommel in North Africa in the Second World War. Now they realized they could be playing a crucial part in what might prove to be the fiercest conflict since then. Brigadier Patrick Cordingley, commanding the 7th Armoured Brigade.
There's a feeling of excitement buzzing around, which I'm sure you can feel. The boys in the sheds woke up this morning with a purpose, going to get the kit unloaded, and really looking forward to getting out into the desert and working alongside the American Marines. It's very exciting.
We're looking forward to soldiering with Patrick's people and aligning ourselves again as we did in the Korean War.
Lieutenant General Sir Peter de la Billière, the overall British commander. Under his watchful eye, Allied soldiers trained hard to operate in the desert. These are British Challenger tanks on exercise. But Allied equipment was clearly technically superior to Iraqi armaments. Challenger and American Abrams tanks, for example, outgunning and outrunning their Soviet-made equivalents in Iraq's army. But first, the line of defences Saddam had ordered to be built along the Kuwaiti border with Saudi Arabia would have to be breached, ditches filled in for tanks to cross. And if they were deeper, bridges to be built. Minefields, Saddam's second line of defence, to be tackled by this strange monster, the aardvark, an armoured tractor with flailing chains that bite into the sand, exploding mines in its path. Or by a device called Giant Viper. A rocket snakes out over the minefield, towing behind it an explosive cord which detonates when it lands to clear the way ahead. But if these fail, old-fashioned methods like probing delicately into the sand to find mines would still be necessary. Training in the Gulf continued for weeks on end. Kuwaiti soldiers too were part of the Allied forces, driven by the burning desire to liberate their homeland and drive out the dictator that they so clearly despised.
I'll kill you, Saddam Hussein. This is Saddam Hussein, no good man. Very, very no good man. نفس الشعور ده اخوان عندكم؟ Yes.
The contribution of the Arab nations to the coalition was no mere token. These Saudi Air Force Tornado bombers were as potent a weapon as any of the Allies possessed. And they certainly had some fearsome weapons like the A-10 tank buster, armed with rockets and a gun that can fire armour-piercing shells at a rate of 4,200 a minute. The high-technology Apache helicopter, specially equipped to fight at night, firing Hellfire missiles to destroy enemy tanks. The once top-secret stealth bomber, designed to deflect enemy radar probes so cleverly that it's all but invisible on the screens of anti-aircraft missile units. The Old Faithful, the 30-year-old B-52 bomber that can fly high above enemy anti-aircraft fire to deliver its load of 750-pound bombs, 100 of them at a time. European Tornado bombers, a swing-wing aircraft capable of delivering special runway-busting bombs after flying low and fast across the desert to dodge under enemy radar. And although some of the Allies' technology, like the Anglo-French Jaguar, is a little more old-fashioned, it's still much more sophisticated than most of the aircraft in Saddam's Air Force. In training, Jaguars provided fast-moving practice targets for naval gunners on Allied warships in the Gulf. Warships had been in the Gulf before. Now they were present in such large numbers they convinced Saddam that the Allies planned a major amphibious landing to retake Kuwait. That was pure bluff, as we shall see, and it worked. The greatest danger to Allied warships were mines. Mine sweeping was crucial, as was a good lookout for mines floating free on the surface. High technology, too, kept its electronic eyes peeled.
Bridge up, we've got a good mine contact. Line of contact up in the centre of your screen, inject possible mine.
The lookout for enemy aircraft and missiles was just as close.
Good morning, gentlemen. Captain with the morning brief. Iraqi forces, they continue at the same level. However, they are extending their defences in southwest Iraq. Personnel in the Kuwait theatre are now building up to over 400,000 troops. They've got over 2,000 armoured personnel carriers and the same number of artillery pieces.
Servicemen whiling away the hours waiting for a war that looked more and more certain. But while the diplomats were still talking, they had to wait. The head of the US Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Colin Powell, visited his men with words of support. By the end of November, he could tell the politicians he was ready to retake Kuwait.
Proud of all of you American people who are solidly behind each and every one of you. Get you home as soon as we can.
At the end of the military build-up, the Allies had amassed 500,000 men, over 3,000 tanks, and nearly 2,000 combat planes in the Gulf. The countdown to war really began on November the 29th, New York. The United Nations sets a deadline for Iraqi withdrawal from Kuwait. After January the 16th, the use of force against Iraq is sanctioned. November the 30th, President Bush in Washington tells Americans that Kuwait will not be another Vietnam. This time he reassures them America won't be embroiled in endless hostilities.
Should military action be required, this will not be another Vietnam. This will not be a protracted, drawn-out war.
There is opposition to war in London and in Washington, but it's a minority of people who protest by chaining themselves to the railings of Downing Street. Still, there are voices not protesting, but filled with concern. For example, in the small town of Quantico in Virginia, a town with many military connections, reservations are expressed.
Why should we die for oil? That's what we're dying for. It's going to be another Vietnam. It's going to be a lot of good boys lost. There's a lot of skepticism. There's a lot of, maybe not quite a lot of opposition, but there is some opposition. Everybody's divided because nobody's come together and said, hey, this is what we need to do.
December the 1st, Saddam visits frontline troops. He plays the Palestinian card, accepting the UN resolution to withdraw from Kuwait if, and only if, international leaders agree to put the Palestinian question on the agenda. The veteran leader of the PLO, Yasser Arafat, supports Saddam's move. Allies say withdrawal from illegally occupied lands must be unconditional. December the 22nd, George Bush meets the new British Prime Minister, John Major. He continues to receive full support from America's staunchest European ally. Both still hope for peace, but expect war.
I think we're both still hoping that there will be a peaceful resolution, but I am convinced that Saddam Hussein hasn't gotten the message yet for some odd reason.
5,000 miles away, Prince Charles visits British troops in Saudi Arabia. a morale booster for the soldiers, and a chance for the prince to express his confidence in Allied troops.
Highly professional, and I personally have every confidence in the way they perform. They always do perform.
As the deadline approaches and the troops wait, the talking continues. January the 9th. In Geneva, peace talks between Iraq and America. Secretary of State Baker and Iraqi Foreign Minister Tariq Aziz fail to agree.
Don't miscalculate the resolve of the American people.
If the American administration decides to attack Iraq militarily, Iraq will defend itself in a very bold manner.
January the 12th, Baghdad Airport. The UN Secretary-General Perez de Cuellar flies in for last-ditch talks with Foreign Minister Aziz. After meeting Saddam, Perez de Cuellar says, God only knows if there'll be a war. January the 14th, elements of the British 1st Armoured Division advance towards the Kuwaiti border. This time it's only a reconnaissance patrol. They know that next time it could be for real. January the 15th, New York, only one day to the deadline. The last faint hopes of diplomatic settlement expire as an 11th-hour French peace initiative collapses. Defense Secretary Dick Cheney knows it's war. Troops on the front line collect their thoughts before the offensive.
I've never had a shot fired at me, and I'd like to know what it was like, you know, if the case comes. And I'd like to know as a man if I'm going to be able to stay there and do my job.
My wife's 7 months pregnant right now, and that's what I think about is whether I'm going to be able to see that child or not.
The Allied divisions move off to war, a convoy many, many miles long, taking frail men and mighty machines to the front, only hours before the UN deadline runs out. Saddam Hussein personally takes command of his troops and visits Kuwait City. He calls on Iraqis to fight to the death and defend their country, and Kuwait, now just another state of Iraq. His promise is to turn Kuwait into a graveyard if the Allies attack. January the 16th, an Allied airbase in Bahrain. Only 3 hours after the deadline expires, an alarm warning of chemical attack. The first signs of action, but this time a false alarm.
All clear, false alarm.
In Baghdad, demonstrators showing support for Saddam Hussein and denouncing President Bush. Only 6 weeks later, they were to realize that Saddam had led them to catastrophe. His troops slaughtered, his capital paralyzed, his country in chaos, his dreams in tatters. War began with the air offensive launched on January the 17th. Some 80,000 sorties were to be flown. The intention to break the Iraqi military machine, to smash command and communications, disable airfields and destroy missile launching sites. The Allied generals declared that civilian targets would be avoided if at all possible. The offensive was devastating and decisive. The many airfields scattered throughout Iraq were principal targets in the first phase of the Allied air operation. Along with the launching zones for its Scud surface-to-surface missiles and its chemical installations, biological warfare factories, ammunition dumps, communications and Republican Guard bases. The sinister stealth bombers spearheaded the raids. This was a plane that hadn't even been seen in public before. Part of its role was the pinpoint bombing of important Iraqi establishments vital to Saddam Hussein's war effort. Establishments often close to or even right in the heart of populated areas, where accuracy was vital to achieve both destruction and the avoiding of civilians. One stealth mission was the hitting of this building, the Ministry of Defense in Baghdad. one of many missions flown in the teeth of opposition from Iraq's anti-aircraft batteries. A video camera mounted aboard the attacking plane showed a direct hit on the ministry building. Despite all the technology, the missions were still hair-raising for the men who had to fly the planes.
I watched some very young men become middle-aged and somewhat more mature that particular night, and I've seen the same thing in the subsequent nights.
That was a sentiment to be expressed many times as the reality of combat was faced. For Arabs on the coalition side, especially Saudis and Kuwaitis away from their homes, Allied air successes came as the first really good news of the crisis. And a crucial part of the air offensive was played by the RAF Tornadoes, 45 of them out of a total UK air fleet of 75. The Tornadoes were to have one of the most dangerous tasks, low-level bombing of enemy airfields to make sure the Iraqi Air Force would offer no effective opposition.
They're giving up yet, Dave? They're giving up yet?
Like the Americans, being in action brought a camaraderie impossible to imagine in peacetime.
The cameras. Hi, we're back. Yeah, well, as I say, it ran on rails. It was well planned. You know, we achieved, well, we're going to have to wait and see what we achieved, but, you know, from what we saw, it was good.
Want to go straight to a debrief, so we're a little rushed at the moment. We're all back.
The ground crews, as in past wars, worked like Fury 2, keeping the planes up to scratch. The Tornadoes carried the JP-233 runway denial bomb to tear huge holes in airfields and scatter anti-personnel devices to deter anyone trying to clear up. They helped kill off the Iraqi Air Force as a fighting unit almost from the start. Air crew drew pistols to help defend themselves if they ended up in enemy territory. The RAF campaign helped persuade Iraq to withdraw many of its combat aircraft from the unequal struggle altogether. Eventually, over 120 planes sought refuge in Iran and stayed there. The Tornadoes continued to fly to attack a wide range of targets. Much of the bombing was at night. The outskirts of Baghdad were hit over and over. For the residents of this and other Iraqi centers, the air raids became a terrifying nightly ordeal, even though the international coalition continued to pronounce it was military targets that were being taken out. For the exhausted crews, the relief that almost all of them made it safe home every time was intense.
Bombs on target. So hopefully we've done some damage. All to the war effort.
And other good news. It is good news.
Absolutely cracking. Absolutely cracking. It's cheered the guys that are here up very much so. So yeah, it's all good stuff.
It's marvellous. That's good. We're all took off. We all got back.
Most of the daylight hours were taken up with getting the planes ready for more sorties, checking them over, ensuring the Iraqis, rather than technical hitches, were the enemy.
Good mark. 5.5 miles.
Low-level flying, the Tornado's speciality, required supreme skills and the closest cooperation between individual pilots.
Keep on going. Okay, happy with that. We've got a rolling looking front on there. Happy with that. Happy with that. Stand by. Keep on going. Stand by.
Okay,
Keep on going. Okay.
Charlie.
Looking good. 2.4 miles. Okay, nothing on the RAF.
Taking out airfields had required its own special training, and the results were spectacular.
Okay. Over ready. Okay, can we see? There we go. It's going. It's going. Keep running. There's the canisters.
The phrase pinpoint accuracy was constantly heard, but all the evidence was that it was almost always achieved to cut supply routes like bridges, as well as blast airfields and installations. Military spokesmen described how the operations were executed.
Going into the target, this one happened to be relatively lightly defended. We had a number of bombers on the raid, obviously. They hit the target and hit it on time, as we're supposed to, and dropped the bombs as accurately as we were able. The nature of the target was such that it burned quite nicely, and we left it burning, and we all came home.
The KC-135, unglamorous but vital workhorses.
Clear takeoff on 30, Canopus 21.
These are the fuel tankers of the air. In order that Allied combat aircraft could operate at maximum effectiveness, spend as much time as possible near and over their targets, they were frequently refueled in mid-air. A tricky business that was a regular feature during the 38 days of unrelenting bombardment. Here too, pinpoint accuracy was what mattered. The RAF crews earned high American praise.
Royal Air Force is very much like the United States Marine Corps. Yet they're very motivated. I would not want that mission that those guys fly because they're down low, they're in the AAA. It's a dirt mission and they're just doing a dynamite job with it. It takes real courage.
Iraqi resistance was mostly ineffective, but several planes did bring back the scars of combat. And in all, 6 tornadoes were lost during the campaign. After the runway denial missions were mostly over, different sorts of bombs were deployed, and tornadoes also carried rockets for some of their attacks. Day and night, the routine of the air assault continued. Planes to be serviced, airmen to face the most grueling campaign since the Second World War. The Allies intended to guarantee victory by winning in the air. By the 10th day of the air offensive, venerable buccaneers arrived from Britain to back up the tornadoes. With them came the laser eyes out under the wings. This equipment would give the ultimate in precision guiding for bombs carried to the battle zone aboard the tornadoes. Out in the Gulf, meanwhile, a large part of the United States aerial battalions were based, flying their share of the huge number of sorties that battered and blasted Iraq's military machine. The sorties included planes equipped with early warning equipment to give plenty of notice of any enemy fighter activity. As aircraft arrived and departed round the clock, it was astonishing just how few did not make it back from the bombing and strafing runs across Iraq and Iraqi-held Kuwait. Altogether, the war cost the Allies 51 planes. Flying is obviously pretty hazardous, but being on the deck of an aircraft carrier at such times clearly has its dangerous moments too. American carriers became like the most hectic of commercial airfields, as places and paths were found for plane after plane, either preparing to fight or returning from a mission. The Americans also operated from land bases in eastern Saudi Arabia. All told, there were 1,800 Allied combat and backup aircraft involved in the war against Iraq. There was no shortage of targets to pick, but Scud missile sites became a priority. Here, hardened bunkers protecting Scuds are attacked. Watch for the Allied missiles zooming in from bottom left. And though mobile Scud launchers were hard to spot, a lot were very effectively dealt with. Pilots described, though, how intimidating AAA anti-aircraft fire could be.
It looks a lot like, you know, lights, flickering lights, like Christmas lights or something like that when the AAA's coming up. And then shortly after that, it looks like some big bomb fireworks or something like that going off. It was an awesome display, it truly was.
On and on went the air offensive. At its peak, 2,000 sorties were being undertaken every 24 hours. And it wasn't just from bases to the south of Iraq. At least one NATO airfield in Turkey, on the enemy's northern flank, was also in use. Out at sea, the very latest in conventional weaponry was aimed at the heart of Iraq, Tomahawk cruise missiles. 184 of them were fired from US battleships, each one costing £500,000. They flew hundreds of miles to reach their targets. Once more, the Allies' commanders declared that only military sites would be hit. The view from the ground. Western TV crews were on hand to record the sea-launched Tomahawks as they sped at 500 miles an hour over Baghdad. Smoke billows up after a missile finds its target somewhere in Baghdad's suburbs. By night, as well as by day, the expensive missiles were dispatched. Each one carried its own onboard computer. Inside its memory, details of the location of the target were locked in. The Americans insisted that such impressive technology made sure that as long as it wasn't brought down in flight, each missile launched would come down exactly where planned.
9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, launch.
Missile away!
Yes, sir.
The missile's job was to demolish Iraq's means of survival, things like Baghdad's main power station. Airborne attacks continued alongside the long-range Tomahawks.
It's a little bit different because this is on the front end of the weapon itself.
The first missile in this attack on an aircraft hangar goes straight home. However, the second one wobbles before it locks back onto its target, and a devastating hit. General Schwarzkopf took particular pride in the precision with which his military could hit what they wanted, while not hitting people involved in non-military pursuits.
I'm now going to show you a picture of the luckiest man in Iraq on this particular day. Keep your eye on the crosshairs, right there. Look at here. Right through the crosshairs. And now in his rearview mirror.
He admitted, though, the dangers.
The appropriate targets. We're being very, very careful in our direction of attacks to avoid damage of any kind to civilian installations. It's going to happen. It is absolutely going to happen. There's no question about it. But we're doing everything we can to prevent it. And that's not carpet bombing by any definition.
effects on Iraq of the onslaught from the skies were catastrophic. As well as strict military targets, the Allies pounded everything that could keep a war going. Power stations were a prime example. Government buildings were carefully picked out and wrecked, the results of the computerized precision targeting that the Allies employed to such remarkable effect. Baghdad suffered a blitz not seen since the last World War, though a strictly selective one. Communications were shattered. Not only was the Iraqis' military command and control structure knocked out, but the country's TV forced off the air as well. The civil population suffered badly. Fractured mains and sewers, compounded by heavy rainfall, had parts of Baghdad awash and prompted fears of disease. River bridges came down as part of the Allied campaign to shatter the infrastructure of what had been a modern state. There's no way of knowing exactly how many people died, for no matter how great the commitment to avoid such casualties, they did occur, as General Schwarzkopf prophesied. What the outside world saw of the damage done both to public and private buildings was strictly under the Iraqis' control. They maintained that the Allies were deliberately hitting civilian targets. The truth seems to be that stray bombs there were, but very few. What did happen was that people and property on the ground suffered a good deal from anti-aircraft fire which came down, and by incoming missiles destroyed in flight before they hit those carefully pre-programmed targets. Petrol dried up, ironic for a state which was one of the world's leading oil producers. But again, Allied bombing disrupted all aspects of life. Strangely, Western journalists who stayed in Baghdad reported little hostility from most ordinary Iraqis, no matter how bad things got. Night after night, as Baghdad was intensively bombed, people took refuge in underground shelters and bunkers. For the people of Iraq, there was little glory, much misery, in a country unable to defend itself against the mightiest military powers on the globe. Their president was assumed to be in his own deep and well-guarded bunker as he and his lieutenants struggled to command their military forces, most of them strung out in the desert under constant Allied bombardment. As the pressure on Iraq grew, so did the strain and danger facing those living in its cities and big towns. Although Saddam Hussein's support faded sharply after the war, during it there was much talk of loyalty, and there was sometimes signs of anger too.
This is not a game, but a human life! A human life! Enough of civilians!
Saddam Hussein will stay here, and we will stay with him until the end of the war, and we will have our big victory here against America and other countries.
Then, on February the 13th, a bunker in the Baghdad suburb of Amaria was bombed, and inside it died some 300 civilians, many of them women and children. The Iraqis declared it was well known to be an air raid shelter. It was a disastrous moment. Much of the Muslim world expressed outrage. America insisted, however, that the place was doubling as a military command center. Officials produced much evidence to support their opinion. A little later, a stray RAF bomb was to kill many civilians in the town of Fallujah. That time there was no argument. An accident of the ghastly sort, all too common in war, had occurred.
We are not indiscriminately targeting civilian targets, and I think that the very action of the Iraqis themselves demonstrate that they know damn well that we're not attacking civilian targets. Since right now they've dispersed their airplanes into residential areas, they've moved their headquarters into schools, they've moved their headquarters into hotel buildings, they put guns and things like that on top of high-rise apartment buildings. Under the Geneva Convention, that gives us a perfect right to go after those things if we wanted to, and we haven't done it.
All through, Iraq kept up its attacks with Scud missiles, deliberately aiming for civilian areas of Saudi Arabia and Israel. Scuds were Russian-built but elderly and inaccurate. As they were fired from remote sites inside Iraq, people, as here in Riyadh, became adept at donning their gas masks and seeking shelter. Opposing the Scuds, American Patriot missiles, which after a while proved pretty effective in bringing the Iraqi weapons down. Which was not great. No military man rated the Scud a dangerous weapon, but their very unpredictability provoked fear. Not all were shot down, and some proved lethal. The result of that, a block of flats pulverized in the Saudi capital. The building was unoccupied, air raid procedures had worked well, so casualties were light. The Scuds over Israel. Again, the American Patriots were fired to try to blow up the incoming missiles. Many did come down, and many Israelis, particularly in Tel Aviv, were wounded, and quite a few died. Yet Israel was persuaded to hold its hand, not to retaliate. Despite the hardline reputation of its right-wing government, the country saw that the Allied coalition was wreaking all the destruction on Iraq that the country's bitterest enemies would wish, and the Patriots did a creditable job defending Israel's skies. Nevertheless, Jerusalem did say it would respond, one day and in its own way. The computerized Patriot anti-missile system was rushed into service from the factory in Massachusetts. It suited America to make tremendous efforts to keep Israel out of the war.
It's basically the computer will determine who's got the best capability of intercepting the missile, and the computer will go ahead and designate the unit to engage. I think Patriot is probably is definitely the king of air defense artillery right now, not only for the United States, but probably in all the free world.
Have you ever missed?
No, I have not.
Iraq had other targets in its sights. They used heavy artillery to destroy the oil refinery at Al-Kafji, a small town just over the Kuwaiti border in Saudi Arabia. A nondescript, deserted place, it was to have great significance a little later. The dense clouds of burning oil that resulted were a foretaste of things to come. All sorts of ecological horrors were forecast during the Gulf War. One soon came true. The Iraqis, having seized Kuwait's oil installations, hit back at the Allies by releasing masses of oil into the Gulf, producing the biggest slicks the world had ever seen. The disaster didn't end with wildlife. Saudi Arabia's population depends for fresh water on desalination plants built on the coastline of the Gulf, plants which would be badly damaged by the deadly tide of oil. The Allied side denounced the Iraqis for this attack on the environment and resolved to try to do something about it. As conservationists debated just how much long-term harm the oil spill would cause, Allied planes switched from their usual targets to bombing wellheads to cut off the oil flow. Success could be gauged by changes in the smoke color. Once it went from black to gray, the menace was under control. Further out in the Gulf, the battleship Wisconsin used its 16-inch guns to assist the bombardment of Republican Guard units ashore.
16-inch is, of course, a great counter the other guy's firepower weapon. It's an anti-materiel weapon. And we prefer shooting at their artillery, at their structures. Don't waste the 16-inch on people. You can do that with other things.
Not a full-size plane, but an unmanned drone, bringing back pictures of the effectiveness of the bombardment, aimed specially at the tanks, hulls down in their U-shaped desert dugouts. Jaguars. They too were now thrown into the offensive against the Republican Guard, switched from the attacks which had mostly destroyed Iraq's strategic defense systems. They carried cluster bombs to rain down the maximum damage on the troops identified as the principal obstacle left in the way of a ground offensive. As ground crews armed the planes, some personal messages were added to the onslaught. The Americans stepped up the attack from the skies. B-52s, the most fearsome bombers the world's known, started hitting targets in Iraq and Kuwait, flying back and forth from the airbase at Fairford in Gloucestershire. In Kuwait, Iraqi forward positions capable of spotting Allied preparations were attacked by wave after wave of US Marine Harriers. Jaguar pilots returned to base with good reports of missions well accomplished.
We're going in there with good intelligence on what they've got and where, so it's helping us out an awful lot.
Because we've given a lot of thought, and because we've played tactics carefully, the Jaguars have had a very successful war and done very well.
The Allied commander explained why such heavy battering was required.
This is war. And the unfortunate part about warfare is that if you are not ferocious, your enemy is, and you take the casualties. And I don't want to see anybody die. But if somebody's going to die, if I have a choice, it's going to be the enemy before it's going to be my troops.
The land war, when it came, was swift and equally decisive. In 100 hours, fast-moving armoured columns routed all but one of the 42 divisions Iraq put in the field. The Allies tore to bits what the Iraqis had left out in the desert after the air onslaught. The Iraqis expected the Allies to attack across Kuwait's southern border, from the west, and above all from the sea, with the 4th US Marines Expeditionary Brigade, 18,000 men, mounting an amphibious landing. General Schwarzkopf did nothing to discourage that view. Desert rats crisscrossed the desert like all the thousands of Allied fighting personnel assembled in the wastes of Saudi Arabia as they embarked on a grueling string of practice sessions, ensuring top-notch readiness for the moment when the signal for a ground campaign would be given. Sea King helicopters brought in supplies for soldiers who've now endured many weeks of desert living. Their heavy artillery practiced the routines that would play their part in pulverizing the final shreds of Iraqi defense. A chemical alert, the reminder that this was potentially an exceptional sort of conflict. There had to be preparations for the possibility of chemical or biological attack. The Desert Rats trained because Iraq had shown itself more than willing to use such frightful weapons against its Iranian enemies during their 8-year war, and had used them against the Kurds in the north of Iraq. So, however cumbersome the gear, the coalition soldiers had to be ready. If the most feared sort of fighting did occur, getting casualties off the battlefield as quickly as possible would be essential. Into position went Rapier anti-aircraft missiles to protect the huge concentration of 10,000 British troops from any airstrikes Iraq might still attempt. Dumps for fuel and ammunition were dug, sealed, ready to keep vehicles running and gunners' demands satisfied as the battle rolled forward. There was more to all this preparation than met the eye and the ear. Part of the intention was to make as much noise and fuss as possible during this phase to make the Iraqi defenders of Kuwait think the Rats were actively preparing to fight in one place, the intention being to fight, actually, somewhere quite different. The sand was a constant problem for anything mechanical. There are 92 links in each tank track. They need individual attention. And when rolling from old to new, you'd better make it accurate, or you roll up into the sand and could spend a day being dug out. But essential Hercules, here coming in to move gunners of the 2nd Field Regiment Royal Artillery to their real location on the battlefront. Of the 80,000 sorties flown during the war, half were transport operations like this one. The miles and miles of convoys required to supply the offensive when it came. The shifting around of men and material was part of the great game of deception. And it was played to the full out in the waters of the Gulf. Naval forces from countries as far apart as Australia and South America took part. They carried out intensive supply and resupply operations and made great show of preparedness. The US carriers had already played an important role in the aerial bombardment of Iraq. Now they were poised to join in the ground war. On the deception side, though, the Okinawa, a US amphibious assault ship. From here were commanded the 18,000 men of the 4th Marines Expeditionary Brigade, the force that Schwarzkopf wanted the Iraqis to believe would lead the seaborne landings on Iraqi-held Kuwait. These are some of America's toughest troops, and they toiled away to be ready for the big day.
That we have a lot more firepower than they can imagine. We have, our training is far superior than their training, and just our strong desire to liberate Kuwait is what's going to make the difference, and we will prevail.
But their big day never came. They weren't used. Iraq was misled into tying down vital troops along Kuwait's shoreline. The pretense was reinforced by the capture of 2 islands, al-Maradim and Qura. The occupiers were obviously ready to give up, and they were insignificant in the military sense, but enormously important psychologically. The Kuwaiti soldiers taking part kissed the soil of the first part of their homeland to be retaken. Artillery and other weapons were left loaded, never fired. Kuwait's flag was hoisted over territory seized back from the Iraqi invaders. A Saudi spy plane takes off to observe Iraqi troop concentrations as the countdown to all-out war went on. And troops on the front line fire a missile which will photograph those enemy positions, filling in more of the details to enable commanders to hit hardest where it'll most matter. After a few moments in the air, valuable pictures are ready to minimize miscalculations when the attack comes. Iraqi defenses being probed in earnest by men of the 40th Heavy Regiment Royal Artillery and their self-propelled guns.
Go back! 279 female! 279 female! 279 female! 279 female! Bah!
U.S. Marine spotters.
Every time we've been seeing people out there, we've been seeing them in at least groups of like 6 or 8 moving around.
They check the artilleryman's handiwork.
Probably 6.
The 40th Heavy got the message. Keep pounding. It was suggested Saddam Hussein, visiting his troops in Kuwait, may have narrowly escaped one such attack. He remained defiant, saying Iraq had weathered the best the Allies could do, promising that much Allied blood would be spilled. General Norman Schwarzkopf was scornful.
Okay, with regard to Saddam Hussein saying that he has met the best that the coalition has to offer, I would only say the best is yet to come. Thank you very much.
The completely unexpected happened on the Kuwaiti border when Iraqi forces massed at Al-Wafra and 2 battalions moved into Al-Khafji. As many as 3,000 Iraqis with tanks and armoured infantry vehicles just drove into the town one night, provoking the first land battle of the Gulf War. Normally, some 14,000 people lived here. But the Saudi border town, once a resort, had been deserted for 2 weeks. It was a fact Saddam Hussein could have found out by watching television. Iraqi movements were spotted by aerial reconnaissance and photographs hurriedly analysed. U.S. Marines artillery was called in.
Roger out. It was about 40 minutes ago, sir, when they were requesting rules of engagement because they had a possible target.
The fire was directed onto Iraqi armour in the streets of Al-Khafji, a U.S. Marine trapped in the town acting as spotter. Although such firepower was used unsparingly and to devastating effect, the actual job of retaking Al-Khafji would be left to Saudi and Qatari Arab forces. One U.S. Marine defined the objective.
Destroy them. Before they destroy us? Hey, look here, we got 2 unidentified vehicles up there in the front, so keep an eye on what's going on. Can you do this later, please? Fire!
Helicopter gunships were called in. These deadly Cobras, which had first seen service in Vietnam, roamed over the battlefield, playing a crucial role as the conflict unfolded. One target was this tower, being used by Iraqi snipers and artillery spotters. It was quickly neutralized. Helicopters also halted Iraqi attempts to reinforce their invaders with additional armor and mechanized infantry. F-16s and Marine Harriers took off to attack Iraqi armored forces said to be massing behind the invading battalions. The Warthogs, the tank-busting Thunderbolts, were also thrown into the Allied counterattack. They claimed up to 41 Iraqi tanks and 19 other vehicles destroyed. One U.S. pilot summed up the effectiveness of the Allied airstrike.
Well, I could say I certainly would not want to be an Iraqi troop up there. Aircraft are swarming over that battlefield like gnats. And like I said, I think my biggest danger up there today was running into another American aircraft delivering ordnance on target.
British Jaguar strike aircraft were also deployed. Some hit Iraqi land targets, others attacked 17 Iraqi missile ships supporting their land forces with rockets and troop reinforcements. 5 of the boats were sunk in the engagement, the other 12 were damaged. On the ground, US Marine spotters came under fire as they continued their task of locating Iraqi pockets of resistance 2 miles away in the town. Incoming heavy mortars proved the Iraqis still had plenty of fight left. Aggressive patrolling on the edge of the town also yielded information about enemy formations. It was a dangerous little job, but necessary before commanders would commit troops to the final moves to retake Khafji. Recapture of ground the Allies had surprisingly lost was a job given to the Arab forces. The Saudi National Guardsmen in their US-built M60 tanks rolled back up the coast road to reoccupy the town. In a typical diplomatic gesture, General Schwarzkopf ensured that the credit would be earned by and given to the Saudi and Qatari forces deployed in that area. Inside the town, wrecked and blackened armoured vehicles. Their destruction bore witness to the ferocity of the battle over what Allied commanders simply referred to as an insignificant village. Some of the Iraqi armour had been hit with pinpoint accuracy by artillery fire called in by this US Marine. Corporal Chuck Ingram's trapped on a roof in Al-Khafji, coolly spotted while Iraqis searched below.
I feel proud that I did my job, but I was scared to death. Honest truth, scared to death.
The victorious Saudis swept through Al-Khafji, past blackened buildings where Iraqi snipers had hidden, past the smoke column marking the Iraqi attack on the local oil refinery. US Marines congratulated the Saudi troops, though there were worries that everyone had been caught napping.
How are you? Congratulations. Good job. Congratulations. Yes, very good.
Schwarzkopf summed up in typically trenchant style.
I don't think we were taken by surprise. As I said, there was nobody. Khafji had been abandoned. I wouldn't really say the Iraqis had seized Khafji. You know, when you walk into an uninhabited place, it's really not much of a seizure.
When the ground offensive finally began, Arab forces moved direct into Kuwait along 3 axes, backed by United States Marines, not from the sea but along the coast. In the West, the Desert Rats and the United States 7th Corps struck at the heart of the elite Republican Guard. After the surprise at Al-Hafji, the Allies stepped up mechanized aggressive patrolling. The 16th, 5th Queen's Lancers take out their reconnaissance tanks, last in service in the Falklands, to probe Iraqi dispositions. A real desert rat, Pedro, adopted by the British contingent as their mascot, naturally. Alongside the desert rats, the Americans heard a chilling lecture about the danger of mines.
He owns anywhere from 10 to 20 million mines. We know he's got at least 10 million. We got pocket receipts on 14 million that he bought. Everybody was supplying him. He was our ally till August. We gave him a bunch of stuff. The Kuwaitis gave him money to go buy state-of-the-art. The Saudis gave him money to buy state-of-the-art. He also went out with his own money. He's got toe poppers, he's got claymores, he's got poppers out there. He's got signal flares. If you get up to some fence, you can guarantee it there's a mine in it. He was buying these in lots of 300,000 for $4.80. This detonator has a built-in anti-handling device, a mercury switch. You pick this mine up, it goes off. You eat 5 pounds of explosives. Explosives in the human body don't get along. This ain't the war to be out there playing Rambo.
It's estimated that 3/4 of US casualties in Vietnam were from mines, hence the concern to be properly briefed.
I didn't realize he had so many types, but we knew that he had a lot of mines out there.
They've got a pretty formidable minefield, but we're not going to be stupid about it. We're not just going to send a human wave through this thing.
He's got a lot of them from a lot of countries. Who let him get them, we don't know, but we're going to have to deal with them now.
The Viper mine clearance device was now on active service. There was one more effort to persuade Iraqi troops not to fight to the end. More leaflets were dropped advising surrender. Few who did surrender, dots on a desert horizon, were herded together by Chinook helicopters. On the very eve of the final battle, the British Desert Rats, the 1st Armoured Division comprising the 4th and 7th Brigades, posed for a dramatic team picture. Desert Rats, it was the ultimate parade. Early on February the 24th, the waiting was over, the preparation done. Allied land forces went into full action against the Iraqis. Driving into battle, Brigadier Christopher Hammerbeck, commander of the 4th Armoured Brigade. Out on the western flank of the Allied positions, the British and French, linking with the 1st US Armoured Division, thrust across the enemy's land, not into Kuwait as the Iraqis had expected, but northward into Iraq itself. Later they'd wheel round, slicing across the north of Kuwait to trap as much of the occupying force as possible. The attack turned into a classic dash. Opposition was, in Schwarzkopf's own words, remarkably light. Inside the British Army's new warrior fighting vehicle, battle taxis the men prefer to call them, the mechanized infantry prepared for their job, at its most severe, killing enemy soldiers in their foxholes.
We do, we're killing on a personal basis. The guys at the top there are killing people from kilometres away. We have to get out and actually clear the places, obviously the grenade, the rifle and the bayonet, if need be.
Does it worry you, the thought of using the bayonet?
Oh no, I've got loved ones back home and I want to get back to them as much as the rest of the guys, so I'm prepared to do anything to get back home.
Another new piece of equipment, the multiple launch rocket system, the battle winner the troops call this, capable of firing ripples of 12 rockets, each containing 644 fragmentation bombs to smash artillery positions and tanks. Not far behind, barrages from more conventional artillery, the Abbott self-propelled howitzers. The artillery commander assessed his men's contribution to Saddam's mother of battles.
From the reports that we had from an aircraft overhead that reported several battery positions badly damaged and some tanks destroyed, it must have created exactly the effect that we wanted at this stage, which is to destroy his long-range systems.
What through your mind as you were firing from action for the first time? Bit of excitement.
The battle moved fast. The order to advance could catch anyone unawares. The weather could still hamper the swiftest moves, but it was time to pause to think very carefully about the next step. The commander of the whole 1st Armoured Division, Major General Rupert Smith, with beret and bespectacled, briefed his senior officers on the decisive engagement, at night with the Republican Guard. There'd been much talk before the ground assault about the Allies' night-fighting superiority. Here the equipment proved itself beyond all doubt. The pattern was a repeat of the daytime experience. The 1st Armoured would usually identify an enemy tank and destroy it, with almost no return fire. And usually the Iraqi crews had scrambled out and surrendered. Daylight, and it was time to consult the maps to chart the course across the barren wasteland following the battle plan, a long right-hand swing down into the north and centre of Kuwait. To their left, the French and Americans had continued pushing deep into Iraq itself. They too were largely unopposed. In the distance, the prisoners began turning up in larger and larger numbers as Iraq's military crumbled away. Everywhere, the wreckage of their army. The British destroyed 200 Republican Guard tanks, losing none themselves. Some had lucky escapes. The crew of this reconnaissance tank escaped unhurt when an American plane mistakenly attacked them. Then came tragedy. The desert rats heard that 9 British soldiers, the youngest 17, died when another American plane hit a Warrior vehicle.
We was about 30 metres away in the wagon, waiting for the guns to dribble on. And there was just a mass explosion which blew us back in the turret. And then when we looked out and seen the wagon had been hit, we moved round in front of the wagon to help with the casualties.
We took a knock yesterday. You're all grown men, you're all soldiers, and we go on. I'm very proud of you last night. It didn't seem to affect what we did in the slightest. So thank you very much indeed. At last, somebody, us, you, me, are teaching a bad guy the lesson. And he's being put down so hard that he's not going to get up again.
Soldiers are killed by their own side in all wars. This time, though, the enemy killed so very few. The 1st Armoured Division pushed on into Kuwait. Here, the 7th Brigade neutralised an Iraqi divisional HQ.
There's clearly evidence in the bunkers of guys just having Baghdad. I mean, there's teapots on, hot tea, smoke coming out, evidence of food, which has probably only been there in the last 24 hours.
Waving anything white, tossing aside their helmets, the bedraggled, dispirited remains of Saddam's forces walked into captivity.
And then we'll give you something to eat, something to drink, and wait for some other people to come and collect you, to take you to somewhere to stay.
Some officers have been shot by their own men, others abandoned them and fled home.
Well, if it was me, I feel a bit sorry for them, really, because the way they've been treated, I mean, you wouldn't treat a dog the way I've seen some of the prisoners of war, which we have on the way up as well. No, it's not fair for them.
They hadn't been paid for months or fed for days.
Well, it's been a long 48 hours since we've crossed the start line, and really I think for all of us it's been a step into the total unknown, an experience which none of us will ever forget.
Across Kuwait's southern border, the Americans stormed through the sand defense walls the Iraqis had thrown up. They proved no protection at all as the 1st and 2nd US Marine Divisions raced into the emirate. Infantrymen fanned out, looking for individual defenders. There were hardly any. Close behind, a pipe, a seam. The pipes fill up anti-tank ditches in seconds, making the going much easier for backup armour. For the foot soldiers, their hour had now come.
The Air Force can't do it all by themselves. They've been doing a good job, but the ground forces, they got to go in. Because I feel that the only person to get another person out of foxhole is the infantryman.
No, I really don't care about oil. I don't care about material things. You know, I'm here so my little brothers won't be in 10 years.
Apache attack helicopters. These were the machines that proved so deadly effective in knocking out tanks and other Iraqi vehicles in close combat. Aptly named Hellfire missiles, which enabled the Apaches to tear through armor cladding after skimming across the desert to find their targets, prompting some Iraqi response. Artillery duels developed, but once more, US firepower proved overwhelming. Mechanized infantry poured rapidly across the border, with Kuwaiti advisors aboard to guide their American liberators across the featureless terrain. America's most up-to-date tank, the M1, able, like the British Challenger, to fire on the move. They were deployed to take on the one part of Saddam's army that might have been effective, the Republican Guard. The Allies began spotting burning oil wells, the first evidence of Iraq's horrendous scorched earth campaign as its forces fell back. The desert's own natural storms had uncovered a vast number of mines sowed by the Iraqis. America used Miklik mine clearers to satisfying effect. Once the mines had been cleared, the Americans moved forward again, past the hulks of hundreds of shattered Soviet-made Iraqi tanks. It had been less of a battle, more a massacre of machinery. Iraqi prisoners poured out of their foxholes, almost pitiful in their relief at being able to give up after the long nightmare of bombardment. These conscripts were obviously terrified that their captors would shoot them out of hand. The ritual search for concealed weapons. Their war over, captives in their thousands were taken away on the transporters that had brought the American tanks to the battlefield. US servicemen found it all astonishing.
There's just nothing like it. It's the biggest 4th of July show you've ever seen. And to see those tanks just boom, and more stuff just keeps spewing out of them, and the shells flying on the ground, and they just become white hot.
However, war's savage unpredictability was proved again when, in the midst of the Allies' land attack, a Scud missile came down on an American Army barracks near the important Allied base at Dhahran in Saudi Arabia. It was the single most costly incident suffered by the United States. 28 reservists died. Yet it was an incident that did nothing to shake America's absolute faith that the Allies' course was right, that Iraq's army must be shattered, faith shared throughout the coalition.
We are continuing to attack and continue to achieve tremendous success against the Iraqi forces in the KTO.
The coalition attack continues to meet with success on the ground, in the air, and at sea.
The battle is going extremely well. It has taken our regiments only 36 hours to neutralize an enemy division.
The Americans and the Europeans played key roles. But equally crucial were the Arab forces. And it was the Arab armies who dashed across the desert wastes, heading for the central objective of Operation Desert Storm. That was the retaking of Kuwait City itself. Kuwaiti forces, like their Iraqi oppressors, were equipped with the latest Russian tanks, the T-72s. And of all the Arabs, the Kuwaitis themselves were understandably the most delighted as resistance faded away and the retaking of their homeland became merely a matter of time, and a short time at that. However, it wasn't all a matter of driving fast to the end of the road. Sometimes the Iraqis slowed things up. Arab armour edged out of range of Iraq's big guns. And in case the Iraqis still called down air power, French-built anti-aircraft missiles were brought to the front. Tuesday, February the 26th, the first Arab forces reached Kuwait City itself. The Iraqis, after a final outburst of looting and destruction, had gone. 7 months of occupation were over. There was jubilation as the Kuwaiti flag, prohibited since early August, was unfurled again.
If it had been our intention to take Iraq, if it had been our intention to destroy the country, if it had been our intention to overrun the country, we could have done it unopposed.
And if I've got one message for the people at home today, it's this: get out there and ring your church bells.
Victory was overwhelming. At a disused airfield inside Allied-held southern Iraq, the victors arrived to dictate peace terms.
How do you feel today, sir? Well, I'll let you know when the meeting's over. Right. I'm feeling pretty good.
General Schwarzkopf, mastermind of a brilliantly successful campaign, determined protocol be observed.
Now, I don't want to embarrass in any way, right? No, sir.
Inside a tent pitched on the desert sands, Schwarzkopf sat alongside the commander of the combined Arab forces, the Saudi General Khalid bin Sultan, facing Iraq's 2 most senior army commanders. They agreed all the Allied terms. Their army and much of the country they'd tried to extinguish had been shattered. Suffered, of course, but on nothing like the scale some had feared. Iraq's revenge as its army collapsed was to set ablaze hundreds of Kuwait's oil wells. North to Basra, one more nightmare. A convoy of fleeing Iraqis devastated in the last Allied air attack of the war. Behind in Kuwait City, the devastation wrought by the Iraqi invaders. Proof began emerging of just how brutal Iraq had been. Those suspected of collaboration were rounded up. Saddam Hussein's dream of conquest had been destroyed, but Kuwaiti vigilantes continued for several days to hunt down Iraqi troops still in hiding.